We need at our table of awareness the logician, but equally we need the intuitive, we need the mystic.
I almost died. I was allowed to go to the very precipice of death, of life and death, and look over the edge. And I was allowed to behold what was there and allowed to come back. Most people aren't.
When we talk about being aligned with ourself or being aligned with our soul or hearing our higher self, that's really what we're talking about, is being connected to that divine part of ourself, that light-filled part of us that is connected to God energy, that is connected to everybody here and every experience we've ever had.
If more doctors, more professionals can open up to use intuitive gifts in their work, that's really important.
Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and medium, and here we explore life, death, mediumship, near-death experiences, consciousness, and what it all means. Many of us, when we lose someone we love, are grieving in the solace of our communities, of other loved ones who have also experienced the loss of the person close to them. But can you imagine grieving with 3,000 people every single year for over 20 years? That is what it has been like for David Ferrugio, whose father died in 9/11. And today on the podcast, we are talking about what it is like to grieve with that many other people and how his life has been shaped by what happened on 9/11. We also talk about his podcast, which is very similar to mine. So if you like his, if you like mine, you'll like his. And if you like his, I bet you'd like mine. It's Dead Talks. And he and I share similar thoughts on what happens after we die, what NDEs tell us about death, and how important spirituality is in living a meaningful life. So with that, here's my episode with David. Welcome, David, to Life, Death, and the Space Between.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
So I have followed your work and your show for so long, but for people who don't know what you do and how you went from a real estate agent to huge podcast host of a podcast called Dead Talks. Tell us your grief journey.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a long story. I know you said we have a certain amount of time, but we'll try to get into
We're
it.
good. We're good. Everybody likes a good story.
Yeah. I mean, the grief journey started, when I was 12. I lost people before that, but my big one, if you will, was my father on September 11th. I was 12 years old, and he was in the World Trade Center. And I think everyone, I don't know if they give a play-by-play of that day outside of my personal story, perhaps, but that was the big one for me. And obviously that was quite a long time ago. I'm 35 now, it was 23 years ago, but that grief journey, if you will, like journey is the perfect word in my opinion, because it is quite the hell of a journey, and it's a constant journey. I'm at a great I think I'm at a great place now. And, people always say, you don't get over grief. It's a part of you. I believe that too, but it does get better, and you're able to handle it in different ways. And I know that might not resonate with everyone. I think it depends on the steps you take and how you absolve it and the people around you. There's just so many variables. But the shorter, long story answer is, that ignited this podcast and this path that I'm on now to normalize the conversation around death. And I specifically use the word death because my conversations aren't just grief oriented. It's heavy grief oriented. So a lot of my conversations do pertain to people's grief stories. And again, other people's stories. Every episode I drop is not just my sob story, but it's sharing other people's journey through grief or any experiences around death from literally every single angle. And my mission is just to normalize that conversation.
Yeah, I think we're clearly on similar missions here. Do you feel comfortable taking us back to that day? It was such a public day, and everybody has a story of that day. And I've heard you talk a little bit about what it's like to have a story of that day where your father died, and to share that story or some version of that story through your grief with the entire world, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if I'm not comfortable talking about it, then I probably should retire this podcast today, to be honest. So I'm quite comfortable talking about it to a point where I think it makes other people uncomfortable. But I think
not here, not here,
not here,
not with the therapist.
Yeah, of course. So, yeah,
if I'm uncomfortable, then I too should retire.
Yeah, of course. And I think making people uncomfortable is something I actually enjoy doing, not in a weird way, just in a way that is exploratory and kind of getting people out of their comfort zone through conversations or experience. I think it can be healthy, but of course I have to read the room and it's not always the time for that. But I mean, in regards to that day, you know, I've said it a million times for anyone that has listened to my podcast or share my story. There's so much I don't remember. And someone from a clinical aspect like you would probably explain it better, but it just seemed like my brain was just on system overload when I first really found out. And the first whisper I got of what was going on, I walked into class, again, 12 years old, 7th grade, my buddy Jeff, who I've mentioned a million times. I actually got to follow up with Jeff. That's my brain going sideways. But he walked in late and he was like, Dave, doesn't your dad work in the World Trade Center? I'm like, yes. And he goes, a plane flew into the building. I'm like, what? I couldn't even, it didn't make sense in any fashion. What do you mean a plane flew into the building?
To any of us at that time. I mean, you were 12, but I was, what was I, like 20 something, 23, 24? And
yeah, but besides even just grasping the entire magnitude of the situation, just that sentence alone without any context makes no sense. Like, of course, it makes no sense even knowing what happened. It's still bizarre, but just hearing that sentence with no context is incredibly bizarre. So when he told me that, I believe I tried going to the office to make a phone call and they wouldn't let me do it. And, you know, for reasons I could only imagine, we lived in a very big commuter town. I think our town may have lost some of the most people because a lot of people worked in the city and yada, yada, yada. And so I essentially had to go through the whole day not knowing what was happening. There was a lot of conversations. I remember kids in my grade were like making fun of me because I was nervous and trying to figure out what was going on, but they didn't know what was going on and we're 12 years old. So it comes with the territory. And then fast forward throughout the day, still not knowing what was happening. I kept hearing kids get called out from school down to the main office. I was not one of them. And I was walking home, my best friend, James, and I think we were just chopping it up, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And I remember the moment walking around the bend, we started getting close to my house, and right around the bend, you could start seeing my family's house. And I saw cars outside, like a shit ton of cars just parked outside. That's the moment I knew something serious was happening because it was like 3:00 on a Tuesday. It just makes no sense why all these cars are outside, parlayed with the news I got. And I walked into the house and my mom separated me and James. And I remember I started making my way to the living room. I saw my cousins there with just a face that I'll never forget. And then it's so interesting with memories that I feel like those get kind of confusing and I never know what's really happened and just my brain taking it, observing it as it is. And 23 years later. But again, I remember they were trying to keep me from the TV and I forced myself to look at it. And that was the first time I saw the footage of the plane going to the building and then collapsing. And at that point, that was later in the afternoon. So it was all done. And it was just now going forwards and backwards. It's a weird thought being like, oh, I went through school the whole day while this was happening, not knowing what was happening. Mm-hmm. And then at some point it was over without even knowing, if that makes sense. So like the building collapsed, my dad was gone and I was watching replays. And it was at that moment when I first saw the tower get hit, go down, the explosion, all the footage that everyone is aware of. I remember breaking down crying. And then I was as if it went black. It was like from that point on, it's like my body just shut it down. I don't remember what happened after I cried. I don't remember who came to me. I don't remember that day after that. There's nothing I remember after, right in that immediate moment. Of course, I have memories afterwards, this and that, but a lot of it is I'm forgetful. And so this day and age, I have to ask my mom.
The brain protects, right? The brain steps in and.
Yeah, of course. And so that was just a big part of that, you know, the day one. And then, you know, there's a whole long list of crap that happened and what I've gone through the last 23 years.
Was there a question as to whether or not your dad was still alive or they knew?
I mean, you can only know so much, but I mean, after having several episodes with my mom and my sister separately, then a family episode, you know, we talked about that on and off the mic, of course. And that was one segment of the recent episode we did in September where it was, you know, you held on to hope and we didn't want to just chalk it up as he's gone immediately because how do you know? But based on the logistics of him being on the 105th floor above where the plane hit, it just, you know, the rational side of you the objective side of you will just, it's hard to hold on hope with that, but you never know. At the same time, maybe he stepped out of the office, he wasn't there, or XYZ. So yeah, there's a level of hope there. But I think my mom, I believe, said the next morning waking up, she was like, he's not coming back. And I don't think she verbalized that to us. Of course, as a strong woman that she is, she's going to hold on hope and strength, as she did, in a way that I can't even describe in words that will do her justice. But she, I think deep down she knew that. Maybe my sisters knew that. They were older, 17, 18. And again, I don't really know where I was at that point, because due to my lack of memory here.
And so what did life look like after that? Again, like this notion of this like public memorial in the face of your private grief. How did that play out over the years?
Yeah, it's an interesting item to talk about, because it's good and bad, but also at the same time, my mentality now have changed over the years, and a lot due to these conversations that I've had. Sometimes I don't look at things as good and bad. Sometimes I just look at things as events, as weird as that sounds. But there was a yin and yang and pros and cons to I think public grief in general. Of course, you have that support, and I'm blessed to still have tremendous support in my inner circle, which is such a big part of grief, having that support. And I'm tremendously aware that not everyone has that. I think almost most people don't have that, or at least definitely the amount that I've had, where it's just, the grateful again isn't even a word that can really express how lucky or blessed I am to have the support I have, because that's such a big part of the grief process or going through anything. So we had that public support in general that may have been indirectly related to us, but then that the magnitude of the publicity behind it also kind of brought the cavalry of other people in our lives that, I felt maybe stepped up for those reasons. But that's the good part. But also, it's a weird exchange, because sometimes you just do want that privacy. You do want those moments by yourself. And I think plenty of people respected that. But at some point, it's like it's constantly in your face, constantly in the news, for even still in these 23 years. We have an anniversary every year. And that's a whole different meaning that I have now. But the publicity, it does have that back and forth effect of, I got the support, but it's also, it was just constant for quite a long time, where it was always in our face. You couldn't escape it. Not that you're ever going to escape it, but it was just constantly berated. And when maybe you want that individual space, not that you can't have it, it was sometimes overshadowed by the publicity of it.
And I just think, like, when I've worked with patients with grief, how they approach the death anniversary is always different, and they get to kind of shape in many ways what that looks like for them. And that's often a part of the work we do, is like, how do you want to acknowledge or maybe not acknowledge that day? Because some people just want to like pretend that day never happened, or move, figure something else to do on that day that isn't a constant reminder. But for you, that's not really much of an option, because it is such a public day in our lives.
Yeah, and I don't personally resonate with the ideation of just pretending something doesn't happen. I mean, hey, respond however you want, whatever works for you. But to me, that makes no sense.
I don't think pretending that it doesn't happen, but like maybe not necessarily sitting in it, or like maybe they have a celebration that day, or they, spend the day doing something to shift the narrative of that day in some way.
Right. No, but I think what you said is true, though. I think people do pretend in various ways, like you just explained, that it didn't happen. Whether it's just like, I have people that I've spoke to on my podcast saying they've had experiences around death, or just any experiences, they won't talk about it. Like a girl I had recently was talking about an experience that she had revolving suicide, and she's like, "Oh, haven't really shared this story because it's a big no-no in my family. Like, we don't talk about it." And I'm not judging that. I'm just saying, from my personal experience, my personal perspectives, I don't agree that's, and everyone has their own formula, their own medication to whatever they got to do. So take it as you want. But to me, I don't think that's the way. I don't think that's the way to go. At least in my life, that's how I don't choose to be. I don't choose to see it. I don't think at any aspect of our family's experience or journey, or me personally, have we pretended it didn't happen. And I understand there's semantics there, or taken mechanisms to avoid it, or this, that, and the other. I think we really sat in it and experienced it, and in different levels to it. I think my sisters, we all experienced it differently. We all absorb it differently. Same with my mom. And I think, to me, confronting it and putting myself there has only helped me. And someone mentioned the words exposure therapy to me, and maybe you explain it better than I will, but maybe, for example, you have a bad experience at a certain place, you go to that bad place, that place you literally physically were, and let those emotions come up as opposed to avoiding it. I think I accidentally did that growing up as a young kid. I would constantly watch the footage. And even today, sometimes I'll still do that, not as much, but I would constantly watch the replays over and over and over again to like a kind of a concerning amount, I would think, where I would look for new footage and watch it over and over again, replay things just to get a feeling out. And it turns out, I think that was exposure therapy. And I think to me, maybe on the surface level, it might seem, oh, don't look at that. Like that's graphic. But you know what? That happened. That's a real world event. And I'm kind of a blending of being raised by like tough love, but at the end of the day, it's real love. And I look at things like that, you know, that happened. That was a real day. That as graphic as that was, that's the reality of the world. These things happen, unfortunately. This is part of the world we are in. And to just avoid it in any ways by not saying pretend again, it's like, no, that's not how I feel I confront things. And to me, I think that really helped me. And it hasn't turned into, it could go either way. I think maybe constantly looking at that footage, you could start getting a real pessimistic view of the world and looking at it in this negative energy, evil aspect, because that's a reality too. But it didn't do that to me for whatever reason, maybe by the way I was raised by my mother and my sisters and the people around me, or exposing myself to new conversations and people. It didn't take me down a path of the world's evil, the world's bad. It made me more grateful and put me in a lens of focusing on the complete opposite by doing this method that I did, whether it's good or bad to others. I'm not saying it's a prognosis that others have to take, but that's what worked for me.
Right. I mean, it is exposure therapy for sure. And there's a lot, I don't remember the research exactly, but there was a lot of research that came out after 9/11, I believe, on like what resulted in some people having PTSD, where the majority of people did not. They were able to kind of move forward with their lives and, you know, work through whatever they needed to work through without that post-traumatic response. And it sounds like for you, you know, part of probably how you manage that grief was to be in that grief and to feel that grief. And then you were able to move through the grief rather than it kind of owning you in that way. You took ownership of it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think maybe I took control of defining it myself as opposed to letting it define me.
So what brought about the podcast for you?
That day, for sure. Obviously, it was many years later, but I had this weird thought or feeling. I feel like when I was younger, I can't pinpoint the exact age, but I feel like I feel like I'm going to be speaking. I don't know. I had this weird feeling that I'm going to be speaking, and I always almost forcefully try to think of new ideas that wasn't going to evolve around my experience with my father and grief that I've experienced in my life. But I always knew that it was going to come back to this. So at some point, you know, I dropped this podcast in 2020, and before that, it was sprouting and becoming more than an idea. But it was convoluted between many reasons. Like, I think I'm very curious by nature, and I like exploring topics that are you know, maybe misunderstood or not understood, or just these big ticket items like death is, I think, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, you know, the most philosophical question. And that intrigues me, of just having those discussions that are specifically uncomfortable, that people I see avoiding. Like, I want to drive into that. And that was a big thing with my conversation with death, mixed with the idea of me being someone, according to my mother, that didn't speak about it as much or didn't express, and becoming someone who became comfortable talking about it. And then tied into the idea that, yeah, my dad died on a public light, and I would always get those text messages every year. I would have that support system 23 years, every year, getting those text messages on 9/11, people thinking about me.
No one's forgetting that day.
Literally, yeah, no one's, that's why I say never forget, I guess. They really nailed that one. And there's there's millions of people that lose someone on a regular Tuesday that don't get that recognition. So it was a blend of all those compartments to share other people's stories, to shed light on those people that maybe haven't lost someone in a public light, to express stories, to explore a very multifaceted conversation that connects us all. Like they say death and taxes, but not everyone pays their taxes, but we're all going to die. And it's so interesting to me that is a conversation that is often avoided, at least in our culture. Other cultures do a much better job in exposure therapy in many ways. They have way different tactics and traditions in handling death in life. And I just thought it was a perfect combination to share other people's stories, because also people that don't have support, they can find this indirect support through hearing other people's stories. And then you look at the comment section, people pour out their souls on the comment section. Like, I'm not one to necessarily always do that because I feel like maybe I have the support and people to talk to. But then I feel like I wonder the people that are commenting, pouring their heart and soul out to share their stories. It was as if these conversations gave them permission to do so, to show it's okay. Mm-hmm. And I think, there's a million other reasons why I want these conversations to keep going, but that is the main artery as to why, I have these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so many people grieve, not only not publicly, but not at all, right? Like, I've worked with people over the course of many years who are first talking about a loss that they experienced, a death that they experienced when they were a child, or, in their teenage years, or even in their adult years, where they never felt like they had the permission to acknowledge, or their family didn't acknowledge that this loss that they experienced was significant. And it was just sort of brushed under the rug, like you said, not acknowledged. And they didn't know where to go, what to do. And so it obviously manifests in many other ways. There's a lot of mental illness as a result of repressed grief and struggles like that. So it's I find something similar. My podcast obviously tends to veer a little bit more on like spirituality and consciousness, which I want to touch on with you too. But I think the grief piece for so many people is a permission slip.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting. I think people that when you do brush it, it's not, sometimes it's as simple to me as just an acknowledgement. And I think if there is a silver lining, I was exposed at a very young age how some wild shit can happen. Like 9/11 in general, there's plenty of tragic events that have happened that are, just as shocking, but to have it happen so close to home, that's usually the difference. And I think people, we see things online, the media, hear stories, but most of the time it's not directly to you. And until something happens, you're not going to be sure how you're going to respond. Like, I have this podcast and I feel like I'm well equipped, but it doesn't mitigate any pain that I'm going to experience in the future when I lose people in my life. It doesn't mitigate the pain, but I feel like I have these modalities and of understanding of maybe give me some bullets in my magazine to react and respond, but also this idea of just contemplating the idea that we're going to die. You don't have to go necessarily so deep, but I was exposed at a young age that, it happened to me like that. And it happened at a young age. Right. So now I'm aware that these things happen in life. And so I'm not like completely shocked when people pass, of course, because it's like, and to me, my simplistic brain, I'm like, yeah, of course, we're all going to die. And it could happen at any time. And I had someone reach out recently, I left a comment saying something like, my mom passed and I don't know how to live anymore. And it's sad. It's really sad. And I send them love. And I sometimes don't want to say too much because I don't want to, sometimes words can make things worse and I'm not an expert at this. So, and I don't know the person. So, I try to keep the comments response at a certain level of neutrality. But in my head, again, just from my perspective, I'm like, it's wild to me because it's like, we all know we're going to die. And I think everyone has this expectation that everyone in our life is just going to be here for the rest of our life. And that's just not the case. I hope that is. Plenty of people are fortunate to have all their loved ones throughout their life and have a longevity that is just amazing. And it's beautiful and very blessed. But a lot of times, they still die. Right. And they still die. So this idea of like surprise to me is confusing. You know what I mean? And it's not confusing because I get it. Because once again, when it happens to you, totally different ballgame. Like, you could be a therapist like you are and have all these modalities prep, but once you get punched in the face, it's like, yeah, are you still on your feet? Are you going to fall down? And there's no wrong response to that. You got to go through it. But again, like the idea that people are so shocked when someone dies and like, how did this happen? To me, I don't see life like that. I'm like, I don't ask, how did this happen? I'm like, it happened. And this is just the journey that we're on. This is the ride that we're on in life. And it may happen, it may not happen, but it's not. Yeah, it's still shock. Of course, like if God forbid I passed away at 35 years old, it's going to be quite shocking. But at the same time, it's like these things happen and people are dealing with this constantly all of the time. And that's the one thing we all share, this expecting the unexpected, that is life.
Right. We are all mortal. It's been a while since I've talked to you about what I'm up to. I want to first start by thanking so many of my supporters who have supported me on Patreon and in my Circle community. What's so exciting now is we have my new Circle community up and running, where if you want to contribute to supporting the podcast, you can do so at different levels for different different values. So head on over to my circle group. You can actually find the link in the show notes below. And there's opportunities to continue to support the podcast. And I have to say, your support of the podcast is frankly what has kept this podcast going over time. I have been funding the podcast solely by myself. I get a little bit of money in advertising dollars, but not a lot. So anything that you can give, if you have found value in this podcast, and it's not just giving without anything back, I will give back to you. You will be a part of this community with opportunities for discounts and conversations and ask Amy anythings. But it's a great opportunity for you to support what hopefully has helped you over the many, many years. Also, there's so many other ways now that you can work with me. I am offering a group course called Live Your Life Backwards, which is finishing its first cohort this winter and has been absolutely incredible. There's retreats coming up. There's workshops. There's one-on-one sessions with me. So many options that we can work together. So make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel. Make sure you're subscribed to my podcast, and make sure you're subscribed to my newsletter, where you will get a free soul wisdom workbook to help you dig deeper into the virtues that you want to be living in this lifetime. We all need so much more spirituality now. We are in a spiritual crisis, and I'm giving you so many tools to tap into your own spirituality. So check out, and don't forget to subscribe to Life, Death, and the Space Between so you never miss an episode.
Yes.
And I think to your point that, back to this exposure therapy, in some way, you, me, that's what we're doing. We're exposing people to their own fears about death. And I always say that I think death is like our fear of death is at the core of our being. And there's a famous therapist who once talked about, if you never address death in therapy, it hasn't been a full treatment, because there's so much that drives that fear. And really, I mean, you talk about it on your podcast. It's not as much about death as it is about life.
Exactly. I mean, death is life, life is death. It's all like it's a revolving door. And I couldn't agree more as what you said, that it does. This idea of exposing yourself to death, everyone's this innate stigma that it's negative. Oh, it's death. No, maybe it's not. And that's a transition to the spiritual conversation. Like, my spirituality has completely evolved. And I've always been open-minded, but now having these conversations, reading certain books, and just exposing myself to different experiences. Like, I've read books on Christianity, I've read books on Buddhism. Like, it's across the board. Even if I don't align with them innately, there's just so many thoughts out there. And a lot of those spirituality conversations do align back to death. Because that is what this life is. We're going to die. And then there's that big question. Is death real, in a sense of, is it all over, this, that, and the other? Mm-hmm. But death, do we actually die beyond our physical body, or is it just our physical body that dies? And the conversation of death, to me, again, is just a conversation about life, and it's all intertwined.
What has been the most fascinating, or who has been the most fascinating guest that you've had on, in terms of how it shifted your perspective on how you think about this?
It's tough to say any specific one. I'm not asking
for a favorite.
Well, I mean, you literally just asked for a favorite, but I hear what you're saying. I mean, in a sense.
Fascinating, most fascinating.
My apologies. That's just the internet intertwined. Most fascinating. Thank you for clarifying. They're all fascinating in so many different ways, but I think the near-death experience ones always fascinate me the most. Mm-hmm. And just in general, all my conversations fascinating, because I hear a lot of consistencies in beliefs, but a lot of differences. And to me, that's so fascinating in one effort. But to me, almost every near-death experience conversation I had and have and will continue to have is always the most fascinating, because it does explore the other side question and the philosophy of what may happen after life, after death. And that, as much as my conversations then deal with the material grief, and, sometimes I go to true crime and war and plenty of other conversations, but I love having the conversation and prospecting about life after death. And I don't take one experience or story as absolute. My beliefs have become stronger and stronger is what I believe based on these conversations. But, those conversations, no matter who they've been, Dr. Mary Hensley or anyone else, these conversations are just so fascinating, because the more I have, the more consistencies I see. Mm-hmm. And it's either everyone's a great liar or everyone's telling the truth, and there are just consistencies. And I think there's too many stories out there for it not to hold some kind of truth, whether it's real or not. That's up to you. But the near-death experience stories always fascinate me the most.
I loved, you just had a woman on, I forget her name, who died right after you interviewed her.
Oh,
Shortly
yeah,
after.
that was Dr. Gladys McGarry. Yeah, she was 103 years old.
Yeah, and she talked about, I think I'm remembering this correctly. She talked about like seeing white light or having loved ones coming to visit her, right? As she
Not as she was dying, I don't believe, but she's had experiences like dreams and whatnot. And
Okay,
I believe, I have to, maybe you're right, but it wasn't an experience about her dying because she not randomly, but she passed.
Yeah, it's
after we
probably not
spoke.
so super random in 103.
Yeah, no, it wasn't, but it was a couple weeks after we spoke, but she's, she's surprised. She was great. And it just happened to take place 2 weeks after we had the episode, which is wild. And it was actually the second guest this year that passed away shortly after we recorded. One was a man that was terminal, and we knew he was going to pass, just didn't know it was going to happen that quick. But yeah, that conversation with Dr. Gladys was interesting. She already had a pretty solid following, and people knew her books and her story, but it was just cool to see one of her clips in the episode perform well. And because it was, she was gone, but she was still making an impact. And I think that idea is kind of correlated to the whole spirituality of how maybe even though she's continuing on through technology and the way of the material world, it's like, I think that's a good kind of thought on maybe how the spiritual world really works. Like maybe we're not completely gone.
Where do you now fall? I think I have a little bit of a sense because you alluded to it with the near-death experiences. But where were you in this belief system? Did you ever have any experiences, any visits, any signs, anything from your dad? And then where do things land for you now in terms of like your belief system on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a perfect formula, but I have a very sporadic belief system on what's going on. But in regards to your other question of me having any experiences, I haven't had any profound experiences that are crazy. I've had plenty of dreams, but every dream that I have, it's not my dad. It's like a different personality form of him, which is always kind of frustrating but weird. I think my sister's had way more direct experiences than I have, but I've had synchronistic experiences that to me, it's like, I believe that was something more. I mean, I'll tell you the one story. And again, it's not like seeing my dad beside my bed type story, but me and my my girlfriend at the time went to New York City, and we take the ferry downtown, which is close to the 9/11 memorial.
Where were you from? What city where'd you grow up?
I was born in Staten Island, New York, raised in Jersey. So my family's still in Jersey, and we went to the city. She's never been to the 9/11 memorial. And I was like, hey, we can go. I suggest seeing it. It's pretty remarkable, but I've been here a million times, so don't go because of me. So it was a very sporadic decision to go, a very like last minute, which is like part of the synchronicity, I think. So we get in there, and, I have my little family access, just skip the line, if you will. And we walk in there, and then as we start getting
privilege to have a family access to that museum, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather have quick access to get into like a cool club or bar or something like that, but this is what I settle with. And so we go in there, and then we walk into one section where I'm pretty sure they always have it. At least at that time I noticed. I didn't really remember it at the time, but there's a loudspeaker when you walk into one specific section, one part of the memorial where they have the names being read like they do over the last 23 years, where people come and read the names of the lost loved ones. And it's just on a loop. So there's 23 years of audio footage of these names being read. So it's quite a lot. And as soon as we walk into that one section, I heard a voice. It wasn't like we were walking around for a little bit and I'm hearing it. I remember just as soon as it became audible, I hear a voice. I'm like, without even being able to compute it fast enough, I'm like, that sounds familiar. Then I hear, and my husband, David Ferrugio, and it ended up being my mom's voice reading my father's name as soon as we walked in there. And I'll never forget, me and my girlfriend were like, what? We just got the chills. Like, we're getting the chills right now thinking about it. And I'll never forget that moment because we just looked at each other like, come on. Like, you could write it off as just a statistical wild coincidence. Of course, I'm not saying that's not a possibility, but just felt different. And the chances of just walking in at that exact moment when it wasn't planned, we were just sitting outside for 5 minutes deciding what to do, got to that moment. Then I hear my mother's name, which I've never heard. I've been there several times. The chances of that happening to me, of course, can be chalked up as an objective coincidence. But to me, that was way too powerful. And it just still resonates with me too much. I'm like, I feel like my dad was just nodding at me. I feel like it was a quick little wink. And as little as that was, it was such a powerful moment for me.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't sound little. I mean, again, like these are those amazing synchronicities that it feels like what are the odds that I mean, the odds are probably so slim that at that exact moment, his exact name by your mom would be read.
You're right. And yeah, and that's like the material world statistical odds and probability, of course. But it's like, all these stories I hear and people talking about that with electricity and all that stuff, those are common ways that people do have experiences with the other side, if you will, whether it's lights or radio frequencies. And that if you want to go down the real woo-woo rabbit hole, it's like we're
very woo over here. So we can
perfect.
woo it. We can woo it up.
We can woo it up. But I mean, in regards to like just everything is frequencies and vibrations. And that's what radio waves are. And the way that the sound is delivered. So it's like, it people that may not believe it, it's like, it makes so much, it's just frequencies. It's all it is. So if in order for like another energetic form to tap into a frequency in a different form, perhaps it doesn't sound that astronomical to me.
Well, and I always say like, no one questions whether or not a dog can hear the things that they hear, right? They hear different frequencies than we hear. And no one's ever like, no, that's not true. We accept that as truth. And I have a hard time understanding, and maybe a scientist could better explain this to me, why we don't accept that there are other frequencies that could have the potential to communicate with us as truth as well.
Yeah, and I was reading the Bhagavad Gita today, ironically, and there's a quote that I didn't prepare for.
Just for fun.
Yeah, I'm just I was gifted it by a random person. I'm just reading it, which is I'm like right in the beginning phases of it, like the introductory part. So I'm not even deep in it. But this one quote that I took note of today, it says, regardless of the context, it goes, "Our research work is imperfect because we are researching things with imperfect senses." And I think that the way I'm diagnosing that is like, yeah, we have these five senses in this human form, in this vessel, if you will, and we are trying to perceive things with these imperfect senses. To us, it's perfect. To us, it's like so extraordinary. I think they are. But at the same time, I just think there's a whole nother level to this of understanding that we are only equipped with certain modalities and senses. Some people may be tapped in more than others when you get the mediums and psychics and that whole path. But it's like we're observing this world with these imperfect senses, and maybe we're just not equipped quite yet to understand this other realm. Like, yeah, we can talk about it like we are and have these anecdotal evidence and personal experiences, and that's enough in some capacity. But at the same time, it's maybe not quite enough to be certain, even though some people are certain. But then you have those people that really want the proof, the hard-earned evidence, and yada yada yada, which is cool. If you need that, that's cool. Whatever you float your boat, bub. But at the same time, it's like I just think we're operating this research, if you will, with imperfect senses, like the book said. And it's like maybe we just don't. That's where faith comes in, and just making your best belief and whatever that may be. And that's just how I see. Like, to me, this stuff resonates. To me, it doesn't seem crazy just because we don't have proof. I just don't think we're at the point of where proof is even possible yet. That's where I'm at.
Well, and I think the question becomes like, what constitutes proof? A randomized controlled trial where you induce near-death experiences for people? It's impossible to do that. But yet we have, like you said, same with me, so many people that I've interviewed who shared stories that there are similar threads. They're not all exactly the same, but they're similar threads. And okay, I guess maybe you could dismiss it. They're all listening to each other and they're all just repeating what the other is saying. But there are profound shifts that these people that occur for these people after these experiences typically. And so it's like, go ahead. No.
Yeah, I'm just saying, and that's where at the end of the day, proof doesn't really matter, because if some of these experiences are so personal that, if it's helping your life for the better, then that's real enough for you. Like I've had my fair share of hallucinogenic experiences, whether on mushrooms or DMT, and yeah, people just chalk it up. It's just, you're just tripping. You're just this, that, and the other. But yeah, okay, that's fine. But it feels real. And at the same time, if it feels real, then it's real. And that's my opinion. It's like, and if at the same time be like, oh, it's just hallucinating, so it's not real. Then what was that experience that I had? What is real? Like, we have this even the word real to me is ambiguous. It's like, yeah, this real is this table, this, that, and the other. But then when you find out everything's vibrating and moving and atoms, like, what do you mean this is moving? This isn't solid, but it feels real to us. So it's like this whole confused word of what's real. And it's like, if you experience it, you feel it, you see it, it means something to you, and then it's real to you. If there's people have different definitions of what's real. And therefore, if there's multiple definitions of what's real, then real isn't objective in some ways. So it's like, if it feels real to you, if it's working in a good way, then rock on.
Right. And both of us sitting in this room could have different realities. So does that mean that what we're both experiencing isn't real?
Exactly. And we're all every individual is walking around with their own lens, their own perspective. And therefore, if there's, I don't know how many people, 7 billion people, how many billion people there are in the world, there's billions of realities. Everyone has their own reality. Everyone justifies what's real, what's not real. There are plenty of tribes that believe in the same thing, and that's great too. But at the same time, it's like the word real is a finicky word, in my opinion, the way I live my life.
Do you feel like this belief system has helped you through your grief?
Yeah. I mean, again, I've had these evolvements and different shifts in beliefs and thought processes and perspectives much later in my life when I was already I feel like,
well, yeah, I imagine at 12. I mean, there are some people who at 12 have these amazing experiences, but I think.
Yeah, of course. Point. But I'm saying my personal journey, it evolved later. But so I don't want to just, yes, in my grief. I mean, I guess so, like in regards to how I dissect and interpret my own grief in the past and maybe where I'm at now. So yeah, it's completely evolved my opinion on everything. And I think it's even helped more my future experiences. I think, like, for example, all these conversations and experiences I've had with losing my father and going through that with my family when my mom almost died last year in July, and she went to cardiac arrest, heart stopped, she was gone. And that whole experience there's a million stories within that tap into the spiritual realm and then just the material world of experiencing trauma and grief. The experience that we had with my family, like I was able to have certain moments with my mom that we can tap into depending on our time that correlated with what I learned in the podcast, and just also tied in with our experience that me and my family already went through and how to handle it. And even though we don't know how to handle it, it was like we went on autopilot and knew how to handle it. And granted, we could have always done things better, this, that, and the other, but it was just it was a poetic flow of handling it with my sisters. It was truly poetic, the way we worked together, the way we were there for each other. One went down, another one stood up, one fell down, the other one caught us. It was back and forth. And I give that complete credit to what we've gone through as a family outside of anything I've done with my podcast. But then also I was able to intertwine and really reflect on the conversations that I've had without even consciously thinking about it. It would just pop up, and I was able to relate to certain conversations or things I've learned jumbled into one formula that was able to help me get through that. And so, yeah, this podcast has tremendously helped get through life. And I think that's, again, back to the conversation that it's not just a conversation around death. It's a conversation about life, because the same equations and things that we need to plug in to get through certain things isn't just about grief. Even though grief is related to death, grief is a part of life, even has nothing to do with the material death. Like grief is just, to me, grief is just every single emotion wrapped into one word. Like there's anger, frustration, guilt. Those are individual experiences in some ways, even though there's layers to that. Grief is all that. And you don't know which one's going to pop up. You don't know when it's going to pop up. Grief is just a smorgasbord of all feelings into one word. And that grief can show up whether you lost someone or not throughout various experiences in our life.
Right. And I actually think that's where we do a death a real disservice, is acting like the only death we ever experience is when we lose the physical loss of someone, because I think deaths are happening all the time, all around us, if we're paying attention to how our life is impacted by changes.
Yeah, it's just loss. It's loss. Even if you lose a job, you start a new job. So you're not really mourning losing a job, being unemployed, but now you lost a totally different routine. Now you got to drive a different way. You got to drive 30 more minutes. You got to wake up earlier, this, that, and the other. It's a silly, small example, but those are individual losses of a routine. So it's like, as if you
or of
really
an identity, right? Like if your identity was tied up in that job, or your friendships, or whatever it was.
Yeah, there's a million different ways, and it can go down up and down the totem pole of smaller to bigger. But it's, I think, but regardless, like you go through grief, you go through these experiences, you listen to your conversations or my conversations. It hasn't just back to not just helping me with my grief. It's helped me with the way I live my life. It's helped me with my everyday life, every experience, the way I wake up and the way I think. It's completely altered my trajectory of how I live my life as a man. I still do. We're all far from perfect. Like I have these modalities, and it even makes it more frustrating because the more I know and the more I feel like what resonates with me. And then when I do mess up and I do make my mistakes, or what just isn't possibly the right decision, I'm like, damn it, like I knew better. So it's almost like ignorance truly is bliss, but that's part of the process. Is the more aware you are, sometimes it could actually force you even down a darker hole, because if you're still not making those choices that you wish you were because you know better, that makes it even worse. But that's part of it, and it's fun. This chaotic ride that is life, I think, is like just fun. I think we're here to have fun with it, even throughout the suffering. And I truly believe that life is suffering, as they say, and we're here to grow. And as simple as that sounds, like it truly, that's what it is. And it's not being happy constantly. Happiness is not a constant, but being content can be a constant. I think that is the fine line that we're trying to figure out. And again, that relates to the near-death experiences. So constantly, everyone always says, we're here to learn. And that is it sounds like a cop-out answer to some people, like, why is all this misery, this, that, and the other? And I think, I don't know the answer to that. I have theories about that and what I've heard, but I think giving a reason to why there's so much horrible things going on in the world is something that we just can't truly understand until we cross over. And then all of a sudden it's going to be like, whoa, now
it all makes sense.
Now I get it. Now it makes sense. So,
well, David, if people don't know who you are or want to know who you are, want to know more about what you do, I love your podcast. I love the title of your podcast. Where can they find you, find your work, everything that you're up to?
Yeah. So if I haven't annoyed you too much and you want to check out the podcast, I promise I have interesting guests. You don't have to always hear me talk, but it's called Dead Talks, DEAD space, 2 words, Dead Talks. If you Google it, it should pop up, but you can watch full episodes on YouTube. You can listen on Apple, Spotify, any podcast platform that you want. I release new episodes every Monday, constantly posting content and trying to have fun with it. And if you want to check us out, please subscribe on all those platforms, or just see if you like it and then decide if you want to subscribe. But I appreciate the time.
And if you like my podcast and you're listening to my podcast, I know people will love yours too. So
I appreciate that. But I really appreciate what you're doing. You know, there's a similar path there, and I think there's enough room for everyone to eat. So I'm happy I'll promote your podcast as well. And
thank you.
The whole point is this conversation. It's not just about one conversation. It's about a magnitude of conversation. So I thank you for doing what you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're trying to shift how people live. We want people to live better than they are and enjoy life more than they do. So I think that's certainly a noble mission for both of us. And to your point, like, it's great. I always love connecting with other people in this space because everybody's got like a little bit of a different lens through which they're viewing, this work that we're doing, but we're all, it feels like, on a similar mission.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. We'll get out of this episode in a second, but like that, the sharing those different lenses. I talk to people all the time about things I don't personally align with, and people always relate, having these conversations, that's what you believe. No, I'm having a conversation to learn. I prefer conversations that don't align with what I have, which I'm progressing to do more of, and just share different perspectives and have a dialogue. And then everyone else that's listening, comment what you think, and hopefully a human level, and not getting angry at people for sharing different things that you don't believe, because it tends to be that people that get angry at things that you don't believe, they make it a personal attack. But it's like, no, we're just having a conversation, share your experience, and you can be like, okay, I disagree, and that's okay. And we can step aside. But it's like being exposed to these new conversations, these new ideals allow you to learn things, and maybe like, that makes sense to me. You can kind of cherry pick what works for you and then live your life how you want. Exactly.
And I always say, just be curious, that's part of the joy of life is curiosity. And I think for me, when I decided that I didn't care what other people thought about my story and how I ended up doing this podcast, that freed me up to just like explore all of this, and I can go pretty far into some interesting realms. So, but I'm like, it's just interesting to hear and explore. And to your point, like, there have to be things we just don't know. Our brains just cannot fully comprehend. And so maybe there is more than we can perceive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But yeah, I think we kept it pretty PG. There's definitely a lot more philosophical theories that I have in my head that we didn't tap into, but maybe another time.
Oh, well, we'll have to have you back, and you and I can go at it around these things.
Perfect. I love it. I appreciate
All right,
the time.
Thanks so much, David. Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.